Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Fiber Broadband Association's Five for Breakfast. We're now on our 29th episode of 2026. Last week in Washington, the Fiber Broadband Association held its summer DC fly-in, where our members met with key members of the House and Senate to discuss critical issues and opportunities to accelerate fiber deployment. FBA's DC fly-in was followed by Fiber Day in the Hill the next day. Fiber Day in the Hill was held in the Rayburn building on Capitol Hill, and we met with over 200 members of Congress and their staff, members of the administration, and members of key agencies such as FCC, NTIA, USDA, to name a few three-letter acronyms. And yesterday, we were in Bozeman, Montana for our regional Fiber Connect workshop. Again, we had incredibly strong attendance, and we also held our Regency Policy Lab. Next, we will be in Omaha in August for our regional fiber workshop, Boston in September, Savannah in October, and Vancouver, British Columbia in November. And we'll finish here with our premier members meeting in Islamorada, Florida, in the Keys in December. Last week on Five for Breakfast, our guest was Colin Riley, the Vice President of Data Strategy and Technical Services for Connected Nations. And he discussed closing broadband gaps with smarter grant oversight. So Colin shared with us the data science behind tracking and assessing risk and compliance for BEAD projects. So if you missed that, you can go to our website and watch the replay. Today on Five for Breakfast, our guest is Dave Thomas, the CEO of Eagle One Resources, to discuss right-of-way wars, winning the fiber deployment battle. David Thomas is the managing member and majority owner of the business. Dave has 35 years of experience in the utility industry and has successfully created many multi-million-dollar projects for the national gas industry. He is the primary contact with the government sector and has been highly successful in developing contact base in governmental utility workforce. He's also cultivated contacts with several other industries, including telecommunications, power, water, and the cable industry. Welcome, Dave, and for our audience, please type in your questions to go. And with that, we are going to turn things over to Dave.
All right, thank you, Gary, for having us on today. Like you said, I'm the managing member with Eagle One Resources. I've been fighting railroads since 1983 when I was a young field engineer, as you can tell, many years ago with that. But we do a lot of work with railroad crossings, installations, whether they have a right for agreements or fees, what state laws, federal laws are, that type of work that we do. One thing I want to be sure that we understand in this podcast today is that we're not asking anybody to compromise safety. We want to be sure everybody comes home safely. So in all of our presentation that we're talking about, we want to be sure that you understand safety is key on what we're talking about. So I'm going to scroll through these slides a little bit here. These are the 4 questions that we've asked the railroads over the years. Railroads will always tell you that they own the land, they have a right for agreements, and that you have to sign their agreements. You have to pay them X number of dollar fees and that type of work. There are a lot of state and federal laws that are on your side. And these 4 questions that we have in our slides here, which you may or may not be able to see, but on the presentation you should be, but they're very simple questions. And we've asked them to the railroads for over 20 years. They've yet to be able to provide us an answer for those questions. The first one is simple. Give us the law that says you have a right to charge an agreement for a public road crossing. The second one is the US DOT FRA website has crossing inventory records, and it lists them as either public or private crossings. The railroad will call them public in order to get federal funding for safety equipment. But then when a utility or a fiber optics company comes to the crossing, all of a sudden it becomes private, and then you have to pay them fees. And one of our questions always, why was it public in 1970? Why is it private now? Third question is, back in 1913, railroads had to list all of their land as either dedicated to public use or not. About 95% of the railroad right-of-ways in the United States are dedicated to public use. Again, the railroad did this because they got funding and was allowed to put it into their rate base. But when you show up to try and get it installed in 2026, they try and call it private. So, and then we question them, why was it public in 1913? Why is it private now? Fourth question is this all these agreements and this stuff could be interfering with interstate commerce? And we're asking them, what's the law that says you have a right to interfere with interstate commerce? That was the whole reason for the 1876 Interstate Commerce Act. Some of the type of crossings that we work with, public road crossings and private crossings. And just to let everybody know that's listening, in 2012, Norfolk Southern Railway actually wrote a letter to one of our customers and says they don't charge license fees for public road crossings. BNSF had a 1998 internal memorandum that said they don't charge for public crossings and they can't force you to sign agreements and or require you to have the insurance coverage that a lot of people don't know anything about. There are a ton of laws that are on your side when you're doing a public road crossing, both federal and state laws. When you get to a private crossing, it's a roll of the dice. If they don't own the land, you've got something to stand on. But if they do own the land, you may end up having to work with the railroad on doing the private crossing. Now, some of the state statutes that are out there, we've listed them here: Wisconsin, Illinois, Iowa, Nebraska, Minnesota. They've got statutes. In Oklahoma, there's a state statute that says the railroad right-of-ways are all public roads. Then you've got court decisions in Michigan, Texas, and Indiana. Knowing this information will help you being able to press up against the railroad and stand up to them about signing agreements. Gary, I don't know if you've ever seen one of the railroad agreements, but we affectionately call them the 17-page give up your firstborn child agreement. So they're very overbearing agreements. This is what we're talking about with the agreements. They have application fees, license fees, reoccurring fees, flagging fees, inspection fees. Give you an example of this. We got one in the other day for a 100-foot crossing in the state of Florida. They wanted $172,000 for the railroad crossing. Obviously, that kills the project for wanting to do something like that. We have found in the past where there are a lot of railroad crossings where they're asking fees, where the railroad doesn't even own the land. And then we push back telling them that, hey, look, you don't own the land. How can you charge us a fee for this? And there's not any state laws that require this. We work all 48 continental states. Maine is the only state that requires railroad crossing agreements. All the other states, if you're in a public road right of way, there's not any laws that says you have to have agreements with this. We were actually sued in Texas in 2015 and won the court case against Union Pacific Railroad, where it stated utilities and fiber companies had a right to utilize and cross railroads at public roads. Now, the next thing is, like, one of the issues that we always talk with our customers about is flagging issues. Again, we don't want to do anything unsafe, but one of the problems that most folks have are the cost and the scheduling. One railroad, Norfolk Southern, had actually posted on their website, and I think they took it down after we brought it up at another discussion, but they were actually advertising that flagging was 180 days. You heard me right, 6 months to schedule flagging, which a lot of times you don't know where you're going to be next week, much less 6 months from now. The other one was cost. We had one railroad in Minnesota. They passed a statute that said they couldn't charge for public road crossings, license fees, agreements, any of that. A particular railroad decided to raise their flagging cost, and we asked for it. They said, well, we'll just bill you for it. And we said, no, we need to get a quote from you. Well, they wanted $5,000 a day with a 3-day minimum for flagging. And we told them, no, we're not going to do that. So, and it was a bore anyway, and they ended up doing the work. So a lot of the other things that some of the railroads ask for are the insurance coverage. Most everybody has this insurance coverage, liability, umbrella, workman's comp, railroad protection, liability insurance, RPL as they call it, may or may not be required. It depends on what the state statute says, but a lot of states do not require to have railroad protective liability, and there's actually a statement that you can add to your COI that will cover this so that you don't have an extra policy. A new one that just came up this last year, one railroad's now asking for, if you're doing a bore, asking for pollution insurance. And that has become a extreme problem because insurance companies do not want to provide pollution insurance. So that's one that we're trying to address now. So you just need to be aware of that. And I think that's pretty much all of my slides. I'd kind of like to open it up to your questions, Gary.
Well, Dave, no, appreciate it. Obviously, you have a lot of experience. I was just Googled the number of railroads in the U.S. and it came up 630 to 700 railroads. That sound about right?
That's correct. With the last estimate we had was roughly about 650. And one of the things that we always try and talk to customers about, we have a group that's called the Railroad Investigation Project Group. We affectionately call it the Rest in Peace Railroad Group. But the Railroad Investigation Project Group, we have a lot of people that are joining, and we're trying to tell everybody, join forces when you're trying to fight a railroad. We ran the numbers. There's about 650 railroads. If you got all of the fiber companies, the utility companies together to fight the railroad, it's about 251 utilities to every railroad. There are a ton of fiber and utility companies. And if you're going to try and fight the railroad, you know, if you're one guy trying to fight a railroad, it's kind of like fighting an 800-pound gorilla. But if everybody got together, the utilities and the fiber companies could be King Kong fighting the 800-pound gorilla. So there's about, you're correct. We estimated roughly around 650 railroads.
Well, that's what, you know, so when I was in Alabama looking at a railroad crossing, and, you know, you mentioned 180 days to get a flagman. And if you have a crossing that has multiple railroads, 3 or 4 railroads, and they all have these different days to be able to get, like, you can't just have a flagman come and cover anybody else's railroad. He only covers the railroad he works for, right?
Correct.
So yeah, so you have to look at, is there 650 different companies that you're going to have to be negotiating with? How many at each particular crossing? Is it one railroad or multiple railroads? And, you know, so for the, you know, railroads and Department of Transportation, you know, the one thing that Director of Transportation explained to me is, you know, when you're in a roadway safety is number one. And so anytime you have people hanging around the roadway or a railroad, it's very, very dangerous. And so they don't have any incentive to damage their safety record and to have anybody around the railroad, so that it's kind of automatically stiff arm. And so at least with DOT, you can get the support of the governor to be able to, you know, help with directives and incentives to, you know, for the Department of Transportation. But railroads, that doesn't work. I mean, how can you be able to encourage railroads to want to see the bigger picture and try to, you know, because it's kind of like when you're throwing a pass, one thing good can happen, but a whole lot of bad things can happen. And, you know, you got to make sure the railroads can see a whole lot more good than bad.
Yes, you're correct. And let me give you an example of that. We had, I was on a call before I got banned from phone calls with UP Railroad because I asked this question. We were on a call one time, and the customer was doing a bore up under the railroad tracks, horizontal directional drill, so it was underground. The only person that was going to be walking across the tracks, and it was right at a sidewalk where they were doing the bore at. there was one person that was going to be walking across the tracks to be able to check the depth. They were going to be 16 feet below the tracks. So the question became up, the UP Railroad representative said that, hey, we've got to, you got to have a flagman for that. And said, look, we understand. Said, but let me ask you this. The guy is going to have somebody watching out for him for traffic. There's warning gates at the railroad. I said, he's got more chance of being hit by a car than he does a train with that. And I mean, you could step off. And the gentleman said, the railroad representative said, well, Mr. Thomas, you need to understand, if he's walking across those tracks, he has to have a flagman. I said, okay, that's fair. I have a question. Do you flag pedestrians as they walk across the tracks on sidewalks? And he said, Mr. Thomas, you don't understand. I went, you're right, I don't. I mean, a person walking across the tracks, I understand safety 100%. I know exactly what you're talking about. But if somebody is just walking across the tracks, he can take 5 steps and be away from a train. And we'll have people watching out for him. It's not like we're pulling equipment across tracks. If you're doing an aerial crossing, we fully understand. That's a whole different issue. But when you're doing a bore up under there, the only person crossing those tracks is a guy walking across, checking the depth. And you're going to have somebody working with them. We want to work safe. We want to work with the railroad. The problem is the railroad wants you to sign the 17-page give up your firstborn child document before they will give you a flagman. We can't continue to be held hostage by the railroad to get a flagman. More than happy to work with them, but at the end of the day, the projects have got to be in. That's the whole reason for the broadband deployment dollars that are floating around there now.
So the part I never could understand is, we know where these roadway crossings are. And like you said, you have to put the road in, you have to put in other utilities. So why wouldn't you just put in a conduit that provides enough room for anybody that's going to be putting utilities to be able to share a conduit, rather than having to each company. So say, if you have a railroad crossing, you could have multiple, dozens of companies that have to come through onto that track at that same spot. And every one of them going to have to go through the exact same pain in a serial fashion.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. You do need to understand, though, that if it's a gas line, if it's a water line, if it's a power line, there are certain regulations out there.
Just like,
yeah, if you're just talking about fiber broadband, fully understand. Yeah, now you could put in a larger, if it's a public road crossing, you could put in a larger casing with many of these multi-duct items in there. But then the question becomes, and I don't know on this side with the different fiber companies that how they lease different ducts and all that stuff. I don't know, but I like your idea. Putting in one large casing, maybe an 8-inch, 10-inch, something like that casing, and then put multiple ducts down through it. We always recommend with our customers trying to do a 4-inch casing or larger size, because now you can get those multi-ducts that I think will hold up to like 16 small inner ducts that you can put inside of a 4-inch casing. We try and ask our customer, when they'll come to us and go like, well, we want to put in an 1.25-inch conduit. Hey, we can do that, but it might be worth your while to go to a 3-inch or a 4-inch, because if 10 years down the road you want to do something else, you have more options. And a lot of times they'll do that. But you're correct. Having that casing in there to be able to put in a multi-duct, that's a great idea.
Well, that's the other thing. I talked to some governors about, why can't we have an executive order to have conduit built into every new bridge that's built, rather than having to do a directional bore on, because when I talk to DOT director and say, why can't we put our facility across under the bridge? And they're like, well, because every time that we need to paint the bridge, you're going to have to call you and pull your stuff off, or, we don't want people on the bridge. They name a list of 50 million reasons why they don't want anybody on their bridge, and you're just going to need to directly bore into that river or whatever is below the bridge. But it just seemed to me, as you're building new things, you should design them so that they have built-in conduit and so forth. I don't know, is that anything that's been in any of your discussions?
We have not had that discussion, but I knew the director of the bridge department in the state of Alabama years ago, and we had talked to him about building channels under a sidewalk where you could have access holes built into the sidewalk that could be locked down or screwed down. And they were looking at that. Now, I don't know where that went, but that was probably about 20 years ago. And but no, that's a great idea to be able to have that on there. I've actually hung a gas line on the side of a bridge, an existing bridge. Not a fun project, let me tell you. Know what you're talking about.
So railroads kind of fall under their own special treatment. So when we're going to, we'll be up in, we've been working on DC on the Hill and trying to get permitting reform, try to find ways to accelerate fiber deployment. Where is the jurisdiction for railroads? Because it doesn't seem, they seem to have their own special rules from back, 100 years ago.
Yeah, Federal Railroad Administration governs the railroads. Now, you need also to understand that fiber optics does not fall under Federal Railroad Administration rules. Neither does water, gas, power, anything else. Only railroads. And that's one of the problems that you'll find over the years. The railroad will say, oh, well, under this law, you have to do this. Well, that's a Federal Railroad Administration law. It does not apply to fiber optics companies. That's and what happened is, I think it was 2010, we actually called the Federal Railroad Administration asking about railroad protective liability insurance. And they told us that only applies to contractors that are working directly for the railroad, not fiber optics companies, not gas, utility companies, that type folks. So the railroad protective liability policies, unless you sign an agreement with the railroad stating that you're going to provide that insurance, there's not a law out there that says you have to have that at a public road crossing. You have to be careful that if somebody tells you there's a law for this, find out where that law came from, because it may not apply to your company.
All right, so what are the big common mistakes that fiber companies run into on railroad crossings with fiber projects?
Well, one of the big problems is that they're not aware of what the laws are for that particular state. We have customers that we're dealing with right now that have paid $3,000 application fees in Minnesota, that Minnesota states you don't have to pay any fees at all. The first thing you need to do is be aware of what state you're in and what the laws are in that state, and if there's any court decisions. And also, you mentioned in Washington, D.C., there's a new federal bill out there that is being worked to help promote broadband deployment. But that's the biggest mistake, not knowing what the laws are that are on your side, and if you're in a public road crossing. The second big mistake is when the railroad comes to you and say, well, you have to sign here and this type of stuff, you may or may not have to sign that. And you need to, and again, knowing the laws are going to be able to tell you that with that. One of the other problems that we've seen in the past has been a lot of the engineering firms may not know all of the specs for the railroad, certain things. A prime example is if you're doing a directional bore under the railroad tracks, if you're at 15 feet below a Union Pacific Railroad track, they require track monitoring, which is where you have to put tags on the railroad tracks and you have to have a professional surveyor come out. It's about a $20,000 expense to do track monitoring. We called UP Railroad and was asking them about this. It ends at 15 feet. We asked them, said, what happens if you go at 16 feet? And they said, oh, you don't have to do it at 16 feet. So we said, great. So we started telling everybody, go 16 feet. You get out of a $20,000 charge. That is the kind of things you need to be cautious. If they tell you you have to have this, start questioning, how do I get out of this? Why, what do I need to do this? Why do I need to do this? And question what's going on. That is some of the things that can save you a ton of money. Uh, One of the other things that we've always asked about, and started back in 2004, was your casing pipe. The railroads want you to end at least 45 feet from the tracks. We normally talk to the customers and say, in your casing pipe about 10 feet outside of the railroad corridor. And the reasoning behind that is, if you ever have to go back in there, you don't have to excavate inside that railroad corridor. Don't have to have flagmen, don't have to have inspectors, ton of things that you can get out of by doing that. And then if you're in a public road right of way, you can work and you can insert, pull, do whatever you need to do without ever having to enter the railroad corridor or disturb anything in that corridor. It's little tricks like that that will pay off big benefits over the years.
So how does, when should a fiber provider seek a railroad expert? I mean, if he has his consultant engineers, it sounds like if he doesn't, a foot or inch or whatever is going to make a big difference, going to end up costing a lot of money.
The sooner you can get up with somebody that knows what they're doing about railroad and how they can address this, the better off you're going to be. Because like with our customers, they'll send it to us, their engineer may draw it up and send it to us, and then we go back to them and go like, hey, look, you need this change, you need this, you could do this, could save you X amount of dollars, this, some different things. Before anything is ever submitted to the railroad and you try to gain approval from the railroad, you need to be sure somebody's looked at that knows some of the things that can help you avoid some costly mistakes. Because once you get it approved by the railroad, if you want to change something, you got to start the process all over again. And that could take you 2, 3, 4 months.
This sounds a lot like, we put on some big events. We have just got one, had 5,000-6,000 people down in Orlando. And when you're negotiating with the hotel, they have a gazillion fees. And, I go back and say, I'm not going to pay this fee. And until I got an expert, I'm pushing. I didn't know what I could negotiate. And when I brought in an expert, they're like, well, they can't negotiate that because of the collective bargaining agreement, but they can negotiate this, this, and this. Is that kind of the way people should think about you guys? Is you've been to this table and you know the people at the table and you know what's negotiable and what's not?
Right. And I'll give you an example of that. We had a railroad, and I think it was UP Railroad, and they're good people. There's nothing wrong with them. But they came in and we submitted a project, and they sat there, and we wanted to bore up under a railroad bridge. We were about 10 or 15 feet away from the bridge footing. And the first initial contact we got from them, oh, you need to relocate this. You got to be 150 feet away from the bridge footing. We emailed them back and said, give us the law that says we have to be 150 feet away from the bridge. And they said, well, this is railroad policy. Well, policy is not law, okay? We're in a public road right away. About maybe 2 days later, we got an email back from them, oh, public road right away, 10 feet's fine. We can do that. So that's the advantage of knowing some of the laws and the ways to push back to the railroads.
So when can you push back and when you can't? Well, Dave, this is fascinating. I'm glad that you're on this case. It sounds like, I know how challenging it is. Railroads kind of have their own little world. But I really appreciate you sharing your expertise with our audience. And you're the guy to call if you get anywhere near a railroad. And I hope everybody comes back next Wednesday. One of my favorite people, Joey Winder, who's the CEO, and executive director of the Shelby Coalition, discuss the importance of advocating to save E-rate program for schools, libraries in America. Joey, always a wealth of information, so look forward to seeing Joey and you guys back next Wednesday. Well, thanks so much, Dave, and I hope you have a cooler rest of your summer.
Thank you. You too. Take care.